We are in Psalm 107 tonight, and now lots of you take notes, and normally I have maybe 2 or 3 main divisions, and then I'll have some subpoints. Tonight's a little bit different. I don't think it's really going to mess you up. It's not going to be that different for you as you're taking notes, but there's really only one main division, and it's because the whole chapter is really focused on, it's just one topic, and that is that God is a redeemer and the redeemer. So the whole thing, all of Psalm 107 is all about God being the redeemer. And then what it does is it's going to give us 5 different ways to show us that God is a redeemer. Okay? Now, we're going through Psalms. In case you do not know, we've been going through some Psalms as we're getting closer to Thanksgiving. And these are 7 Psalms, as you can see, for giving thanks. All of the Psalms, there's 150 Psalms. There's all sorts of different topics. I've chosen 7 out of there that focus on Thanksgiving, giving thanks, teaching us about giving thanks. And what we've been doing is, as we've gone through them, we're learning about other things that we can thank God for. Because lots of times we might be thankful for things, but normally we're thankful for things, for stuff, items that we own, or food that we're going to have when we get to the Thanksgiving table. And what we're learning through these Psalms is that there are things that we can thank God for that are they're not things, they're not stuff, they're not possessions that we own. It's not something like something tangible, but oftentimes it's a characteristic of God. And this is another one of those times. We can be thankful that God is a redeemer, and we'll see 5 pictures of how he redeems. Now, here's what I did on my notes, as I said, wonderful works. Now, where did I get wonderful works from? Well, down in verse 8, you'll see, oh, that men, and that's people, mankind. So, ladies, you're not counted out there. Oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. So that's where I got wonderful works from. Now, the fact that he's a redeemer, you can see there in verse 1, oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. These terms, these phrases, some of these words are synonymous. He's a redeemer, and he redeems because he is good. Well, what about him is good? Well, for one, his mercy endures forever there in verse 1. So really, they're all interchangeable. And what I did was I just chose my favorite out of those phrases or those words. And I thought, well, you know what? What I'm seeing in Psalm 107 is 5 wonderful works of God. Why does he do those wonderful works? Well, because he's a redeemer, because he redeems people. And we'll see that all through these verses. So the first wonderful work, if you still need a Bible, go ahead and raise your hand up and we will get one to you. The first of the wonderful works is that he leads the lost. That's the first 9 verses. He leads the lost. Now, we'll begin at verse 1 with this command, really, oh, give thanks to the Lord. So really the psalmist is saying, you gotta thank God. Well, why, someone would ask? For he is good. Well, what's so good about him? Verse 1, he answers that question. Well, his mercy endures forever, and in the original language, it just says, for his mercy forever. So his mercy is forever. It lasts forever. It is forever. It's never ending. So he's the Lord. We should give him thanks. Why? Because he's good. Well, what about him is good? Well, his mercy is forever. Okay? And then the psalmist, what the psalmist does is the psalmist says, well, tell you what, let me show you what's good about God. Why is he merciful? Why do we call him merciful? And he begins that in verse 2. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Now, what does it mean to be redeemed? Well, he tells us what it means in the second part of verse 2, whom he has redeemed from the hand of the enemy. Now, the word redeemed could mean, most often it means to buy back something, okay? When you have plastics or cans, if anybody in here recycles, you go to the recycling center, turn in your cans or your plastics, what you're doing is you're redeeming money, you're getting money back that you paid for those containers. So you're getting money back, okay? Now, in this case, the word word redeemed is the same as rescued. So in verse 2, whom he has rescued from the hand of the enemy. He rescued them. Now we understand that Jesus, or I guess we should say that God the Father, bought us back from the enemy, and he made the payment with Jesus, the life of Jesus. Okay? So he redeemed us. However, we're in the Old Testament here in Psalms, and so in the Old Testament, Jesus hasn't been born yet, but God is still a redeemer. So he's buying back or rescuing. Now here's what he says. He says, let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Say what? Say that the Lord is good, that his mercy endures forever, whom he has redeemed from the hand of the enemy. Now he begins to tell us about those that have been redeemed from the hand of the enemy. Verse 3, and gathered out of the lands from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south. So that's poetic. He's saying God gathered them from everywhere. And in verse 4, it tells us that these individuals were homeless. Now, again, I'm not going to be putting all of these things up on the screen. There's so much in these verses. But if you want to jot these things down, or if you've got a Bible and you want to write or underline or whatever, you can do that, because really there's so much. It's jam-packed. Verse 4, we find out that these people that have been redeemed, that they were homeless. Verse 4, they wandered in the wilderness in a desolate way, an empty way. They found no city to dwell in. So they were just wandering from place to place to place to place. Now, we're in California. We see lots of homeless in California, and we see them wandering from place to place, really no place to live, no place to stay. They sleep wherever they can oftentimes. And we would not often think of those individuals as people that God was going to save, or maybe some people might look at them and go, oh, God doesn't love those people. But we understand that he does love those people. And here is this group of homeless people in verse 4. And what do we find out about them? Well, they've been wandering in the wilderness in a desolate way, and they have found no city to dwell in. So they were homeless. And then verse 5 tells us that they were also hungry. Again, like homeless people, so many homeless people, hungry and thirsty. Their soul fainted in them. Their soul fainted in them, meaning that they were so hungry and so thirsty that they became hopeless. They went from homeless to also being hopeless. And that can happen. All of us, I'm sure, have experienced. We haven't experienced starvation, but you definitely have experienced being hungry. And you go, oh man, I'm starving. And you know, it's funny how being hungry physically, or even thirsty physically, can cause us to become so discouraged. I mean, I can get so grouchy. If it's been a long day, busy, I haven't been eating, usually I could just keep pushing through. But usually there comes a point where, man, I'm so hungry. It's like, everybody get out of my way. I just need, give me a piece of bread with butter on it, something. But you can get so angry, so angry from being hungry. We have a term for it. It's called hangry. Okay? Here in verse 5, their soul fainted in them. They became hopeless. They had no home. They had no food, nothing to drink. But look at this in verse 6. It goes from verse 6 down to verse 9. We see that they were hopeful. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. And he, here it is, delivered them out of their distresses. Now, why did he deliver them? Because he's good, because this is a wonderful work, because he leads the lost, and because they cried out to him in their trouble, meaning they cried out to him for help. So they humbled themselves and cried out, and he delivered them out of their distresses. And in verse 7, and he led them forth by the right way. Remember earlier in verse 4, it said that they were in a desolate way. Now in verse 6, because the Lord is now leading them, rather verse 7, that the Lord led them forth by the right way. But you'll notice the emphasis here. Verse 6, he delivered. Verse 7, he led them. And in verse 7, not only did he lead them by the right way, but that they might go to a city for a dwelling place. So he gave them, he provided a home for these homeless people. And then something that we're going to see several times in these verses, verse 8, oh, that man would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. So he's given us reasons to be thankful here. And he tells us, first of all, that the Lord should be thanked because he's good. Well, how do we know he's good? Well, because his mercy endures forever. Okay, well, show me. And the psalmist says, okay, I'll show you. Let me show you some of his wonderful works. And the first thing that he does is he shows us that God can provide a home for the homeless. He welcomes the wanderer. So if you're here tonight and you're wandering through life trying to figure out, what am I doing? And, what about my spiritual life? And does God even love me? Good news. He welcomes the wanderer. He satisfies the stranger. Those that maybe are on the outside and maybe you feel like, I'm on the outside. I'm not really a good Christian. I don't even know if I'm a Christian. Well, guess what? Good news. He welcomes the wanderer. And he tells us in verse 9, he satisfies the longing soul. So if your soul is longing for peace, justice, he satisfies the longing soul. If you're hungry spiritually, he does that. And finally in verse 9, and fills the hungry soul with goodness. So, by the way, Mary quoted this in Luke chapter 1, verse 53. She actually said, and he fills the hungry soul with good. But notice this, verse 6, he delivered. Verse 7, he led them. Verse 9, he satisfies. Verse 9, he fills. Those are all things that God does. These are all pictures or examples of his goodness and his never-ending mercy. Now the next group begins in verse 10. Let me put that up there for you. Goes down to verse 16. And the second of his wonderful works, the wonderful things that he does, is that he rescues rebels, those that are rebellious. Verse 10. Those who sat in darkness and in the shadow of death, bound in affliction and irons. Why were they sitting in darkness and in the shadow of death? Well, in verse 10, they were bound, or they were captured or captive, and they were in affliction and irons. So not only were they afflicted, tortured, but also they were in irons. So this is the picture of somebody who's being held captive. Verse 11, why were they in that condition? He tells us, verse 11, because they rebelled against the words of God and despised the counsel of the Most High. That phrase, Most High, is another title for God. He's the Most High. Well, these individuals rebelled against God, and they hated his counsel. They didn't want to hear his word. It's like, I don't want to hear that. And so what did God do? Did God just forsake them and say, well, forget these people, they hate me, and so, you know what, I'm just going to send them all to hell, and I don't even care? No, in fact, he did the opposite, verse 12. Therefore, he brought down their heart with labor. They fell down, and there was none to help. So it's saying that God actually put a heavy burden on them. They fell down. In other words, they got to a place where there was no one else to help. We call it, they're at the bottom of the barrel, or they're at their wit's end, or they're at the bottom of their rope, the end of their rope. Those are all different things. We say, well, you know what? There's nowhere to go, but up, or whatever, when we're down at our lowest. Well, what he's telling us is that part of God's work was getting these individuals who hated God, who rebelled against him. He brought them to the point, he brought them low to the point that there was nobody else to help. And then what did they do in verse 13? Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. That's the same thing that happened to me. When my dad came home, I was a teenager. My dad came home and was sharing the gospel with us as a family, and I was like, you know what? I don't even want to hear all that. I don't want to have anything to do with that Christianity stuff. I didn't want to give my heart to God because I wanted to stay in control of my heart. Well, after 20 years, I at the age of 20, I finally realized, like, me being in control of my own life, it was a hot mess at that point. So then I surrendered my heart to the Lord. But what God did was, over those years from being a teenager to the time that I was 20, he kept working in my life to the point that he got me so low that I had nowhere else to turn. At that point, I realized only God can help me. Only God can help me. So that's what he did in verse 12. He brought them down their heart with labor. They fell down. There was none to help. But then in verse 13, because of that, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. And look what he did. He saved them out of their distresses. What's he doing? He's rescuing the rebel. Doesn't stop there. Verse 14. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death. And he broke their chains that they were chained with in pieces. Oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. What do you mean he's good? Well, he rescues the rebels. It's one of his wonderful works. And in verse 16, for he has broken the gates of bronze. These were gates that they would have been trapped behind. He has broken the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron in two. Only he could do that. Bronze would be a very strong, heavy metal that people couldn't just break through. Again, iron, and yet God was able to break those without much effort. But you'll notice again the emphasis. You have these people being rebellious in verses 10 and 11. But look at verse 12. He brought down their heart. In verse 13, he saved them. Verse 14, he brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and broke their chains. Verse 16, he has broken the gates of bronze and he cut the bars of iron in two. So again, the emphasis is on God. This is one of his wonderful works. This is what he does. He leads those that are lost, that are wandering. He leads those that are rebellious. Again, there may be someone in here who tonight is going, hey, you know what? I don't really want to hear from God. I just came with a friend, or my mom slowed down to 45 and pushed me out of the car. I didn't really have a choice, and so here I am. I don't really care. Well, guess what? You would think that you know what? I'm going to come in here. I've heard so many things over the years. People show up at church. Well, the walls are going to fall down. Why? Well, because I'm so sinful. Like you're the most sinful person that God's ever encountered, or what? What are you trying to say? God, join the club. Thank you. He rescues the rebels. Those that are rebellious, he rescues them. But there is that process of him taking that proud, hard person and humbling them. But I've seen him do it over and over and over. And he's probably done it in lots of the hearts in here. And some of you may still be trying to fight him. Well, listen, the more you fight, the lower he's going to get you. Because he loves you. It's not just that he wants to torture you or make your life hard. He's doing that because he wants to get you to the point where you'll call out to him and then he can save you. Well, what's the next wondrous or wonderful work that he does? He saves the sick in verses 17 through 22. Fools. He's not calling you fools. He's saying fools. He's going to describe the fools for us. Fools, because of their transgression, because they've sinned or trespassed against God and his word. Fools because of their transgression and because of their iniquities, their sins, they were afflicted. Now, you'll note a pattern here. Back in verse 10, or rather verse 11, these are individuals that rebelled against the words of God. They despised the counsel of the Most High. Now, in verse 17, these are people that are afflicted because of their own sinful lifestyle. So again, you would think that, well, these people are sinners. They're making the choice to sin. God's probably just over it. In fact, he's not. In fact, he loves those people. In fact, he's willing to work in their lives to change them. They were afflicted. Verse 18. Their soul abhorred or hated all manner of food, and they drew near to the gates of death. In other words, they were so afflicted or sick they couldn't even eat. And they drew near the gates of death. That's a poetic way of saying they were about to die. They were on, we'd say, death's doorstep. Well, verse 19 says, then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. And he saved them out of their distresses. That's incredible. Because if somebody hated me and didn't want anything to do with me, and then later on came back and said, hey, could you give me a hand with something? How would I respond? I'd probably say, why would I do that? Get out of here. You don't even like me. And yet these individuals have rebelled against God, and yet God, when they cried out to God, he saved them out of their distresses. Verse 19. Verse 20. He sent his word and healed them and delivered them from their destructions. That is wonderful. Remember Jesus, oftentimes, there were times where he would speak and somebody would be healed. Oftentimes he might lay hands. There was times where he spit in the dirt, made mud, rubbed it on somebody's eyes, which sounds really gross. But he would heal all sorts of different ways, but there were times when he would just speak a word and somebody would be healed. That's the picture here, verse 20. He sent his word and healed them and delivered them from their destructions. And obviously I can't pass this up because this is what we're doing right now is we're studying God's word, and God's word can heal us, can heal the hardness in our heart, can heal the wandering heart, the sick heart. That's what his word does. He delivered them from their destructions in verse 20. And then in verse 21, we've heard it before, oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness. What goodness? Well, the fact that he leads the lost, rescues the rebels, saves the sick. These are his wonderful works. He does those because he's good. Verse 21, for his wonderful works to the children of men. Verse 22, let them sacrifice the sacrifices of thanksgiving and declare his works with rejoicing. You see there? This is a perfect verse for a room full of teenagers. I know that some of you have money, and you make money babysitting or mowing lawns or whatever it is that you do, and maybe you can give some money to the Lord. Maybe at church you can put some in the box or the bag or whatever, but there are a lot of us in here that do not have money. You don't make any money. Whatever money you have is maybe allowance that you get from your parents or whatever, so you don't have a lot of money. But what do you have? Well, look at this in verse 22. Let them sacrifice the sacrifices of thanksgiving. It's a sacrifice to God, an appropriate, approved sacrifice to God for us to give him thanks. You go, really, just giving him thanks? That's a sacrifice? Yes. You can offer that to him. God, thank you so much for who you are. And then in verse 22, and declare his works with rejoicing. That sounds familiar. The last probably 3 Psalms that we've been in previous to this, we heard that combo of giving God thanks and singing praises. And here he says, give him thanks in verse 22 and declare his works with rejoicing. It doesn't necessarily mean singing, but it sounds a lot to me like he's saying, hey, you got to declare it with your mouth. Make his works known. Declare his works and do so with rejoicing. Let people know how God has worked in your life. I know a lot of you want to talk to your friends or family about the Lord. You want to talk to them and share with them that good news. But maybe you're, how do I do that? Like, I don't really know, like, how do I launch into it? It's always a good idea to share with people what God is doing in your life. To say, hey, let me tell you about what God's been, saying to my heart or speaking to me, or here's what I'm doing. I'm involved. Yeah, I'm involved in the church choir, or yeah, I serve at church. I do this, or I help in children's ministry or whatever. And you start to share with them about what God's doing in your life. That's a wonderful way to introduce people to God. Because a lot of people have the picture of God being like some old man up in the sky with a big gray beard and probably moves real slow and he's real mean and he throws lightning bolts at people. And, you can't really serve him because you're not holy enough and, you're sinful. And so and for you to be able to share with them, no, I actually serve God. I get to serve God. And yeah, I serve on Wednesdays or I serve on Sundays or I do this, I do these things, or this is what God is doing in my life. Declare his works and do so with rejoicing. Now, what else does he do? What's the next of his wonderful works? The fourth one is that he settles storms. This is one of my favorites here. Verse 23, those who go down to the sea in ships. So these would be sailors who do business on great waters. They see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. That means in the deep ocean. Verse 25, for he commands and raises the stormy wind. Now notice how this works here. Verse 25, God, he commands and raises the stormy wind. That wind in verse 25, which lifts up the waves of the sea. Verse 26, they mount up to the heavens. In other words, they go super high, those waves during a storm. They go down again to the depths. Their soul melts because of trouble. One of my least favorite movies is The Perfect Storm. And I haven't seen it in a long time, so don't go watch it. I don't remember if there's cussing in it or not. It probably is because they're sailors. But don't go watch it and then be like, your mom or dad are like, hey, what are you watching? There's all kinds of cussing. Oh, Pastor Chris said it's okay to watch it. I did not say that. Told you I haven't seen it in a long time. And probably the last time I saw it was probably on something that we used to call TV. and there's probably a clean version. But I haven't seen it in a long time. It's one of my least favorite movies because of the storm at the end. I hate the idea of being out in the middle of the ocean in a storm, and that little boat is just, man, it's just way up and it's way down, and it turns over, and it's just it really is a terrible ending. It's so sad. But you really, and we've got videos, all the time, see them on YouTube, everywhere else, of a storm at sea, and it's incredibly terrifying. Well, that's what he's describing here. They go up to the heavens, they come back down to the depths. And look at this in verse 26. They mount up to the heavens, they go down again to the depths. Their soul melts because of trouble. Their soul melts because of trouble. In other words, they are so terrified, these sailors, that their soul melts inside of them. 27, verse 27, they reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man. To reel to and fro means that you're out of control, going backwards and forwards. And it says staggering like a drunken man. It's the picture of this sailor who is on the deck of a ship in the middle of the storm, and they're just being thrown everywhere. And they can't stand still. They're just, they're all over the place. I was on a little fishing boat on Big Bear Lake. This is several years back with a couple of friends. And the absolutely funniest thing happened. It was a good sized boat, but it was still small. It wasn't little, not like a little rowboat. One of the guys, it belonged to one of the guys. And they weren't really paying attention to where they were at. And these are bigger guys, bigger than me. And one of them was up at the front of the boat, and he was doing something, kind of leaning over the side, doing something with his fishing line or whatever. Well, the other one wasn't paying attention, and he kind of walked to the same side, and that whole boat just started to tip forward. And I saw the guy that was leaning over the rail. I saw him, when he felt the boat tipping, I saw him look back at the other guy with just horror on his face. And the other guy realized what was going on, and he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry," and he backed up right away. And the boat wasn't going to flip over, but it felt like it in that moment. The guy had no control. He was about to fall over the rail, he felt like. And I, of course, when I saw my friend terrified, of course, I just laughed my head off. It was hilarious. But that's the idea, is that there's no control because the wave is so strong that the boat is just going everywhere, and the sailor on board has no control whatsoever. The ocean is in total control. Really, it's God commanding and raising the stormy wind. But it goes on to say in verse 27, they reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man and are at their wits' end. They've got nothing. Verse 28, then they cry out to the Lord in their trouble. Familiar scene. He brings them out of their distresses. He calms the storm so that its waves are still. Then they are glad because they are quiet. So he guides them to their desired haven. Did you notice? He brings them out, verse 28. Verse 29, he calms the storm. Verse 30, he guides them to their desired haven. Oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. Let them exalt him also in the assembly of the people and praise him in the company of the elders. So let them rejoice. Let them proclaim. These sailors, most definitely, once they got to shore, would just be like, oh, thank God that we made it here alive. But if you, again, as we've done at each step of the way, he leads the lost, he rescues the rebels, he saves the sick, and now he settles the storms. Every one of us have either experienced storms in our lives, or, I'm sorry to tell you, if you haven't, you will. All of us will. And it might come through sickness. It might come through something that happens in a relationship. Could be something that happens in your family and, with your parents. It could be something, whatever. There's so many things that life can throw at us that will cause a storm in our hearts and our souls. And we'll find ourselves, spiritually speaking, emotionally speaking, we'll find ourselves being tossed to and fro, staggering like a drunken man, at our wits' end, out of hope, because life can be so incredibly nasty, with sickness, with death, with worry, with trouble. It's important to know that God can settle the storm. It's what he does. It's one of his wonderful works. You go, what do I got to do? Maybe you're in the midst of a storm right now. Maybe it's a big one. Maybe it's not that big, but it's a storm. What do I got to do? You do what they did. In verse 28, then they cry out to the Lord in their trouble. He brings them out of their distresses. You humble yourself and you say, God, I need help. I can't do this. I'm out of control. I need you. And he will settle the storm. Wonderful news. Finally, in verse 33, some people didn't believe that we would ever get here, but here we are. Verses 33 to 42, we see that the last of his wonderful works, and again, these are not all the wonderful works that God does, but these are 5 that the psalmist decided to write about, is that he protects the poor. Verse 33, he turns rivers into a wilderness, and the water springs into dry ground. In other words, he can turn it into the opposite. A fruitful land into barrenness, for the wickedness of those who dwell in it. In other words, if he is disciplining or judging the wicked, he can ruin their land, really. Verse 35, he turns a wilderness into pools of water, a dry land into water springs. So see, he can do the opposite. Verse 36, there he makes the hungry dwell, that they may establish a city for a dwelling place. In other words, he can turn a barren wasteland into a dwelling place for the hungry. Verse 37, they sow fields and plant vineyards, that they may yield or get a fruitful harvest. He also blesses them, and they multiply greatly. And he does not let their cattle decrease. When they are diminished and brought low through oppression, affliction, and sorrow, he pours contempt on princes, or judgment or hatred on princes. In other words, if these individuals that God is providing for, these poor people, are being oppressed by princes, God will judge the prince. Verse 40, and causes them, the princes, to wander in the wilderness when there is no way, where there is no way. Verse 41, yet he sets the poor on high, far from affliction, and makes their families like a flock. In other words, the family grows. The righteous see it and rejoice, and all iniquity stops its mouth. All sin stops its mouth. Sin, iniquity stops speaking, stops boasting. And then in verse 43, he finishes with a different phrase than what he had used previously in the passage, but it's a wonderful phrase. Whoever is wise will observe these things. That's where we want to be. We want to be wise. We don't want to be fools. And he tells us that one of the characteristics of a wise individual is that they will observe these things. Observe what? He says that you'll pay attention to all of these wonderful works. The fact that God leads the lost, that he rescues the rebels, he saves the sick, settles the storms, and protects the poor. He's saying pay attention to those things. Learn those things. In fact, in verse 43, and they will understand the loving kindness of the Lord. There's that word loving kindness. We've seen it in several of these Psalms. Hesed, H-E-S-E-D. It's a covenant love or a loyal love. A love that really only the Lord can give. But if we're wise, we'll pay attention to all these things. And you might go, you know what? I'm not really experiencing any of those things right now. Well, there may come a time in your life when you will be. And it's so important for you to know that God is a redeemer who performs wonderful works. And he can save you from whatever situation you may be in. That's what this psalmist is telling us. He's telling us all these things so that we will give thanks to the Lord for his goodness. What goodness? All of this. All of these wonderful works. God redeems us, buys us back, or rescues us from these situations. Now, we are going to break for small groups in just